Well, thank you very much, Mia, and thank you all for coming out on a horrible rainy night. It's always easy to say that the speaker tonight needs no introduction, but it really is true of Max. You are a multifaceted person with a multifaceted career. You're an author, a journalist, a military historian. Your work has appeared in every British national newspaper. Your books have been published around the world. You've been interviewed in many foreign newspapers, on many foreign media. You've written over 30 books. You've written about the World Wars. You've written about Vietnam. You've written about the Falklands. I won't go through the whole long list. And quite rightly, you've won a lot of awards for what you've done. You've been Journalist and Editor of the Year. You've won medals. You must have a stash of medals somewhere that you keep, including the Pritzker Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. And fairly recently, in 2019, you won the Arthur Ross Literary Award from the US Council on Foreign Relations for your book on Vietnam. And tonight, I'm going to be asking you about your new book, Operation Biting, the 1942 Assault to Capture Hitler's Radar. So I'm going to start by asking you, because this seems to me something you do a lot in your books, and also when you write articles, why you like telling stories so much? Why is it important, do you think, to tell a story?
I think all of us who do what you and I do, we're all storytellers. And I should say, instead, for anybody who hasn't looked at the book is actually dedicated to Margaret, who is my heroine among historians. So this is a bit of a love-in tonight. It's a great privilege. It's a great privilege for me to be interviewed by Margaret, who does what she does so absolutely brilliantly. One of the things I learned when I was a journalist is everybody has a story to tell. When I tell almost everybody I meet, especially those who are getting old, you ought to write your memoirs, it's because, I don't mean for commercial publication, but I mean for your family and for yourselves. Everybody in this hall has a story to tell about their own lives that's worth listening to. And one of the things I found out as a young journalist, and I've carried through onto the books that I write, is that I absolutely adored. I've sat in huts in northern China. I've sat in innumerable suburban bungees all over America. I've interviewed Frenchmen and Germans and so on. And I've been absolutely gripped by listening to what they've got to tell. And I've sometimes felt, when they were all alive, the veterans of World War II especially, that I think some of them felt a sense of frustration. They thought, why am I talking about my experiences to him? He's going to go off and make money out of writing about my story. But it is, if one's lucky enough to have some gift as a storyteller, then it's a lovely thing to be able to do. And the way I tell this story, the reason I've written this book, which is about a small commando raid in France in 1942, and the commando raid itself was really, in the grand scheme of things, no big deal. We'll come on to that later. But when I thought about it, it involves so many extraordinary personalities, starting with Winston Churchill, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the preposterous figure whom Churchill had made Chief of Combined Operations, Boy Browning, husband of Daphne du Maurier, who was head of airborne forces, and some of the humbler people, the head of the French intelligence network in France, who got the intelligence about, so all these personalities. So what I've done, I've told this story through all these individuals. And as I always do with the books, what one finds so enormously rewarding about doing this is you get absolutely gripped by the people you're writing about. And the same, you know it all, you've done it all yourself. But we are so lucky to be able to do this.
But that comes over in the book because you don't necessarily like your characters, but you're interested in them. And so you get this wonderful sense of these people at their time dealing with these great issues, and sometimes with very small issues. But what I also liked about the book, and in your other books as well, you have a capacity to be above and look at the great strategic picture, and also look at some of the things that go into making the story important. So in this story, science and technology is very important, isn't it? What's the importance for Operation Biting of what they're doing?
There are two aspects of Operation Biting. The first, which in a way was the big one, was that after Dunkirk, in 1940 that Winston Churchill understood with a clarity that not many other people in Britain did understand, that rationally there was absolutely no way that Britain could win the war, and that it was going to be years before a completely disarmed British army was ever going to be able to engage with the Germans anywhere important. And although the Brits have written a lot about the Desert War and the Italian campaign and all the stuff that went on in the Mediterranean, in the grand scheme of the Second World War, none of this mattered much. But Churchill understood very clearly that although it was going to be years and years before there was going to be any hope of renewing the war on the continent, that it was absolutely vital to maintain a semblance of activity in the war effort. The British people, if they saw nothing happening, all right, we were bombing Germany, all right, there was the convoy war, which of course was vital, but it was defensive. And Churchill understood the importance of what I call military theatre, which was something, the story of Biting was put all over the front pages of every British newspaper after it happened in February 1942. And this was the main deck headline in all the major papers because there was so little else going on and the British Army was doing so little. And so that business of Churchill's understanding, which a lot of the generals did not understand, that to appear to keep the war going was vital. But of course there was a second strand, which was a scientific one, which was that this wonderful, brilliant, another fabulous personality, R.V. Jones, the scientific intelligence officer who worked between MI6 and the RAF. And R.V. Jones was a genius at figuring out the ins and outs of German radar. And when one day R.V. Jones was brought, this is about December 41, he was brought an aerial photograph which showed this new type of radar on the coast of France, which the Germans had codenamed Würzburg. And Jones pored over this. He's very young, he was only about 28 at the time, 29. And he pored over this photograph and he traced a defile down the cliff on which the radar station stood. And he said to his assistant who was with him, he said, we could get in there. This was only 90 miles from the coast of Britain. And he immediately conceived the idea that a British raiding force could get in there. And he told Lord Cherwell, Churchill's principal scientific advisor, who of course told Churchill. Churchill thought this was a wonderful idea. It was referred to the chiefs of staff. Chiefs of staff were not very interested in these sort of little raids, but they signed it off, they authorized it. And then center stage steps this preposterous figure, Lord Louis Mountbatten, whom Churchill had just made Chief of Combined Operations with instructions to launch raids all over the continent. And the moment that Dickie Mountbatten heard about it, he thought this was an absolutely wonderful idea. And Mountbatten was a great showman. And when he took the job, very, very reluctantly, he hadn't wanted to take the job of head of combined operations. But when he said he'd rather remain in command of a ship at sea because he wanted to be First Sea Lord, Churchill said, what can you expect if you remain at sea except to be sunk in a larger and more expensive ship? And so Dickie Mountbatten was finally persuaded that he should take this job. And I've said a little bit unkindly, but not totally, he saw combined operations as a film set in which he was going to be executive producer, and which was going to cheer up the British people no end, but was also going to be jolly good for the image of Dickie Mountbatten. And so he was always center stage in all these operations, and he loved these piratical ventures. So the moment Dickie Mountbatten heard about this idea to go and snatch this radar set, he immediately embraced the idea and said, we've got to do this. And he put planners onto it. One of the planners, this was another aspect of his preposterous way he went about waging war, he'd appointed as his head of intelligence at Combined Operations a Cuban aristocrat called the Marquis of Casamori, with whom he'd been in his polo team before the war. And what qualifications the Marquis of Casamori had for being head of intelligence and combined operations, we do not know. But there he was, and there was the planning staff. And the first thing they realized when they started looking at this, you could not do what R.V. Jones had first thought of, land and get up the defile in the cliff, because the Germans had had 2 years to wire and mine the beaches, and any British force that landed from the sea was going to be mown down. But at Churchill's instructions, Britain had just started to create airborne forces, and they had 2 parachute battalions. And it seemed a wonderful idea to make this a tryout of the first parachute battalions. They hadn't even called it the parachute regiment yet. And this was commanded by another amazing figure called Boy Browning. And Boy Browning went down in history later as a principal cheerleader for the Arnhem operation with disastrous consequences. But in 1942, all everybody knew about Boy Browning. He was an impeccably dressed guardsman who was actually doing quite well organizing the airborne forces, and he was married to Daphne du Maurier. And I got terribly interested in him too. When you start reading Daphne du Maurier's story, and you see the letter, for example, that she wrote to her sister in the middle of the war, when Boy Browning had just started to assemble the men for Operation Biting. And Daphne du Maurier wrote to her sister, and she said, when I send Boy back to the army, she said, it's like sending a small boy back to prep school. He sobs in my arms at night. He was suffering from post-traumatic stress from the First World War. He was a very troubled personality. And Daphne du Maurier had just started having an affair with the bloke in whose house they were both billeted. So he had plenty to give him things to think about while he was trying to plan Operation Biting. So anyway, all these flamboyant personalities set about organizing this operation that a company of almost entirely Scots from the very tough end of the Gorbals and from the Highlands was assembled to carry out this operation, commanded by this wonderful officer called Johnny Frost, who'd never seen action. And they set about planning this terrific boys' own adventure.
I do love the way you have strong views on your characters. I'm getting the impression you don't much care for Mountbatten. But why was the radar so important? Because
the bomber offensive, Britain's bomber offensive, which was at that time our main weapon against Germany, was running into more and more trouble from radar-directed German night fighters. And R.V. Jones was brilliant at working out by sheer brain power how German radar worked, but he didn't know how the Würzburg worked. And he wanted to get not only a Würzburg, but one of its operators. And if he was successful in figuring this out, once they figured out how the Germans were directing their night fighter defenses, then they could reconfigure the tactics of Bomber Command to meet this.
Yeah. I loved your story about was it 2 technical experts who found themselves volunteered to go and dismantle the radar?
Yes, it was a terribly sweet little man who'd been a cinema projectionist in Wisbech in Cambridgeshire before the war, he was one day sitting manning his radar station down in Devon, minding his own business, and he suddenly found himself summoned to the Air Ministry and plonked in front of an Air Commodore and said, well, it's splendid that you volunteered for this dangerous mission, and we're all very grateful. And little Charlie said, I haven't volunteered for anything. And then the Air Commodore said, well, I was told you had, but you've got a very good chance of survival. And this is something that could be of great service to the Royal Air Force. So this rather splendid little chap agreed to go on this operation and was sent off to learn to parachute and then to join C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion for the training. But his biggest problem was that he, coming from Wisbech in Cambridgeshire, for the first week or 2 he was with them, he couldn't understand a word any of them said in broad Scots.
So you've been a paratrooper yourself.
Well, only in a rather amateurish fashion.
Well, I mean, please tell us something about it if you want, but I wonder if you could say something, reflect perhaps on the role of paratroops in war, because there was great excitement about them, wasn't there, at the beginning of the Second World War, and has the excitement been, has it been worth it? Have paratroops proved to be as valuable as everyone thought?
Everybody thought in 1940 that the Germans had succeeded with their blitzkrieg because they'd used paratroops so brilliantly. In fact, the most successful parachute or airborne operations of the war were all done with gliders. But it caught Churchill's imagination, the German Fallschirmjäger, and he ordered that a force of 5,000 British paratroopers should be created. And in the end, 3 airborne divisions were created. And an airborne officer whom I greatly admired, called Geoffrey Powell, he wrote a book, a memoir. He was at Arnhem and all sorts of other operations. And he was a very bright guy. He said, he wrote after the end of the war, that he thought that all these exceptionally courageous, motivated young men who signed up for the airborne in the middle of the war when the rest of the army wasn't doing much, they would actually, he felt, have been better employed fighting with ordinary infantry and armoured units rather than forming. Because, of course, the trouble is with airborne, it consumes a huge amount of aircraft, a huge amount of resources. Training all these guys is a hell of a business. It was so, but on the other hand, for small operations, parachuting is great. The trouble is, if you drop 1,000 parachutists or even 100, you've not the slightest idea where half of them are going to land. Yeah. Because the Royal Air Force wasn't very accurate at bombing targets in Germany at that time of the war in 1942, that the RAF was having trouble finding a given city in Germany. Yeah. Never mind finding a given factory or whatever. And the same way with paratroopers, if you sent a whole squadron of RAF bombers out to drop paratroopers, as they did with Operation Biting, well, some of them miraculously turned up the right place, but a lot of the other ones were all over northern France. Yeah. Although, again, another of the many ironies about Operation Biting, if all the paratroopers whom they dropped, all 120 of them, had landed in the right place, the Germans could have immediately figured out what they were there to do. But as it was, because they were scattered all over Normandy, the Germans were completely baffled and spent the first 2 hours after they landed trying to figure out what the British were trying to do.
That is something that comes over in your very good description of the actual operation, is just how much accident there is in war and how many things can go wrong. I mean, sometimes it seems to me miraculous that they actually carried it off. Given I mean, here they were landing in the middle of the night in dark fields, not able to get in touch with each other quite often until quite several hours afterwards. And so, I mean, all these operations are often very well planned, but I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with me that sometimes accident.
Even if you go up to D-Day, when the Allied forces were at their peak of training and planning, there were still innumerable cock-ups. Fortunately, there were more on the German side. But one of the things I'm always trying to explain in all my books, and I think you and I are often delivering the same message, you in a much more erudite fashion, but nonetheless, basically, we generally agree about the way these things turn out. And Lord Tedder, who was Eisenhower's deputy in World War II, in the last stages, he wrote in a memoir after the war, he said, war is organized confusion. And one thing people today have great difficulty understanding is that all wars are an endless procession of cock-ups. And during the whole Afghan and Iraq campaigns, when soldiers who died in Afghanistan and their deaths were subject to civilian inquests in Britain, conducted by civilian coroners, who all asked the sort of questions they might have asked if somebody had died in a crash on the M4. Yeah. And it's not like that. You're dealing with very young men, you're dealing with absolute chaos, and what's miraculous is how much goes right amidst how much goes wrong. And in a way, Operation Biting was, as with all these things, it was a comedy of errors in which, fortunately, the German response was more comic than the failures on the British side.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because we tend to think of how efficient the Germans were as a military force, but Operation Biting does not show them at their best, does it?
The worst consequence of Operation Biting and its success, and one of the reasons I love writing the story, is I really wanted to write a story with a happy ending. Yeah. And sometimes people come up with wonderful ideas for books they think I might want to write, which are about military catastrophes, and actually it gets a bit depressing. I mean, after I wrote a book on 1914, I had quite a few letters from readers who said, now why don't you write a book about 1915 and 1916? And I said, but the war got more and more depressing, and it's pretty depressing to write about it as well as to read about it. It was, the Germans did respond incredibly incompetently to Biting, to these paratroopers descending into the snow. And this made it possible. The British had all the luck that night. They had a long succession of miracles. And everything went their way. And this gave Dickie Mountbatten, who, although he was a brilliant showman, I don't think there were an enormous number of brains there.
Don't hold back.
It gave them wildly exaggerated ideas of what you could get away with the Germans. And never again in the war did the Allies launch raids on the coast of France, to which the Germans responded so slowly. All the other triumphs that Mountbatten instigated, the Saint-Nazaire raid and then the Dieppe raid and so on, in which Canadians were the principal victims, were absolute catastrophes because the Germans were wide awake. But just that night, I mean, for instance, actually, one example of the luck, intelligence gathering by the resistance in France was a very chancy business, and especially in 1942, that early in the war, a lot of the people who did it were arrested very quickly and executed. But another figure I've written a lot about in the book, Colonel Ramey, who directed the intelligence network for de Gaulle in northern France. And he received a message from London asking him to find details of the defenses at Bruneval, where the radar station was located. And he got hold of two guys in his network and asked them if they could go down there and look. And of course, at that stage of the war, the Germans had not had much dealings with resistance and hadn't been subjected to many raids. So these two very brave guys, they drove down to Normandy. One of them was a garagiste, and so he had a permit, because of being a garagiste, to be able to drive around the coastal region. They went down to Bruneval, and they got out of the car, and there was this defile from the hotel where they stopped. And they walked down the defile. The hotelier said, "You're mad." He knew they were resistance people. "If you go down there, the Germans are crawling down there. You'll be arrested and shot." But they said, "We've got to go and look." And they went down there, and they get to a barbed wire entanglement, and they find a rather bored German sentry. And one of the guys spoke German himself. And this German was immediately disarmed by being addressed in fluent German. And they said, "Well, we've just come down from Paris for the day, and we'd love to see the sea before we go home." And this German made the biggest mistake of his career as a supporter of Adolf Hitler by saying, "Okay, I'll take you." And so he led them through the barbed wire entanglement, and they walked down to the beach, and they all said how much they admired the sea and what a beautiful view and how lovely it had all been before the war. And they then walked back up to the hotel, got back in their car, drove back to Paris, and all this information was about how many Germans there were, where the barbed wire entanglements were, where everything else was all wireless to London. Now, the number of times in the war, you can count on the fingers of one hand that sort of intelligence was, first of all, collected, was accurate, was wireless successfully to London. The Germans did not decode the message, and the guys were not then, they were later, but they were not shot. Yeah. So that was the first miracle. And you just had this series of miracles. And actually, we all live in a world in which an awful lot is not going, shall we say, absolutely perfectly. And it's lovely to be able to write about something where the good guys kept getting it right, and they kept having the luck. And I'm afraid as Mr. Putin can tell us, that does not always happen.
I was just going to ask you, I was thinking as you were talking about the paratroops and intelligence, just to come up to the present, when the Russian forces invaded Ukraine, they did use paratroops,
yeah.
And they also seem to have had very bad intelligence about the possible reaction of Ukraine. I mean, what comparisons can we make between what happened when the invasion of Ukraine started and the Second World War?
I was talking only a week or two ago to a former head of one of Britain's intelligence services, and we were agreeing that there's far more bad intelligence around than good intelligence, and that's as true now as it was then. And it is so difficult. But the other problem is if you work under a tyranny, you always tend in the end to tell your bosses what they want to hear, as they're always doing with Putin. And I've no doubt they do in China with President Xi. But in the end, what matters is truth-telling. And one of Winston Churchill's many enormous virtues is I can't ever recall a case. He often lost his temper with people who told him things he didn't want to hear. But I can never recall a case where Churchill removed from his job somebody who told him the truth merely because it was something Churchill didn't want to hear. Churchill was willing to hear the facts, and that's a huge virtue in a leader. Most leaders, I mean, we've only got to look at Tony Blair in Iraq to see, you know, I always thought it astounding that the head of the intelligence service of SIS wasn't sacked for his role in conveying false intelligence that took Britain into a war under false pretenses. But these days, especially, we don't really do sackings, do we? We don't sack people who screw it up.
No, we move them sideways or...
Well, quite often, actually, Tony Blair rather tended, the man on the Joint Intelligence Committee who was also up to his neck in that, John Scarlett, Tony Blair rewarded him by promoting him to be the next head of SIS. Yeah. God.
Yeah. Do you think it's more difficult today? I will go back to Operation Biting, but I mean, what struck me about Churchill was he was intensely interested in it, but he didn't interfere with the actual operational details.
What he did do, the scene when they came back from Operation Biting, there was an absolutely wonderful scene that Major Johnny Frost, a lovely man, who'd commanded it, and Boyd Browning didn't really like him, I think, because Browning regarded Frost as too prone to ask awkward questions, and Browning liked people who saluted and said yes sir and did exactly what Browning told them. But Frost was just climbing exhausted into the bath in his quarters in Wiltshire when somebody bangs on the door and said, "You've got to go straight to London because the Prime Minister wants to see you." And he's driven to London and he's shown into the underground cabinet war rooms, which I'm sure many of you visited. And Churchill had assembled the entire war cabinet, plus all the chiefs of staff, to hear the story of this tiny raid involving 120 men on the coast of France. Why had he done this? Because at the end of February 1942, there was so little good news that even while the raid had been going on, the Japanese had invaded Java, they'd sunk the heavy cruiser Exeter. In the desert, things were going pretty appallingly. And Churchill was desperate for some good news. And so when it came, he wanted all the rest of Britain's war leadership to hear it. And so Churchill, when Frost walked in, Churchill said, "Bravo, Frost, bravo, now tell us all about it." But Dickie Mountbatten wasn't having that. He elbowed Frost aside and stood up and gave the talk himself about how the whole operation had gone. And you have to laugh. I mean, I think Frost managed to laugh more or less about the way that Mountbatten ever after always regarded Operation Biting as his baby. It was his one real success as Chief of Combined Operations.
Of course, it's very important in modern wars, particularly when the population is engaged, to keep spirit up, isn't it? Because, and as you say, 1942, especially the first 6 months, were pretty grim.
I always remember all the men in our family were lucky enough to have had exciting wars and to have survived with the right number of arms and legs. And when I was a child, I remember my father and his friends and my uncles and so on, they'd been with the SAS, or my father had been war correspondent, picture post, all banging on about what a wonderful time they had. And my mother used to rage about this. And when they'd gone out of the room, my mother would say, you were never to listen to your father talking drivel about the war. The war was ghastly from beginning to end. It was all the separations, the sacrifices, the sheer dreariness. All right, nobody in Britain starved, but as we know, the food was unbelievably dreary. The separations, the fact that husbands and wives and whole families separated for years on end, and many, many wives eventually becoming unfaithful to their absent husbands, but usually consumed with guilt about it. So there wasn't a lot of happiness about. And of course there was a small number of people, young men who were not attached and had no commitments, who managed to have a wonderful time in the war. But they were a tiny minority. For most people, the war was absolutely bloody, and I think my mother was absolutely correct. And one of the things I'm always trying to convey in my books, yes, Operation Biting is a heroic story of people doing things very well. But if one looks at the broader picture of the Second World War and all wars, I mean, damn it, you've only got to look at what's going on in Ukraine. What do we think that war's like for the Ukrainians? And one thing that makes me rage is our successive prime ministers cheerleading, going to Kiev and embracing Zelensky in the street. They have done almost nothing to provide the practical assistance the Ukrainians need. They talked a brilliant game, but they have never dared to tell the British people that if we really want to give the Ukrainians the help they need, we are going to have to make sacrifices. And no British government has the bottle to tell people these things. And so the Ukrainians are at the moment in a desperate strait. And so if one wants to know what was the Second World War like for an awful lot of British people, just look at what it's like for the Ukrainians today. And the answer is not much fun.
Can we just, I agree with you completely, can we just go back to this whole question of how political leaders can interfere with military decisions? I mean, at least in this, I mean, we know that Stalin interfered with a lot of made some very bad decisions and resulted in a lot of Soviet soldiers getting kidnapped and killed, especially in the first months of the war, and then eventually backed off. But today, with rapid communications, the temptation is there, isn't it always, for political leaders to get involved in the monitoring of actual operations on the ground?
I saw something of it in the Falklands, where Julian Thompson, the wonderful man, Royal Marine, who was in Commander 3 Commander Brigade, every day we were at San Carlos, he had to spend about 45 minutes or sometimes up to 3 hours on the telephone, on the satellite link to Northwood, to the command back here. And the amount of backseat driving that went on, to the point that finally Northwood, sitting back there in England with no sense at all of the difficulties, the logistics difficulties, the weather, all the rest of it down there in the Falklands. And Julian Thompson was told that he got to send a battalion to attack Goose Green, for instance, or if he refused to do so, they put in another brigadier who would. And so all that second guessing. And sometimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you've got instant communications between the Ministry of Defense and even platoons out in the field, there were more than a few cases of people in the Ministry of Defense or at Northwood trying to micromanage firefights in Afghanistan. And of course it drives the people who are doing it mad. And so communications, I think the ideal for a soldier was when the British sent Napier and an expeditionary force into Abyssinia in, I forget the exact date, I think it was about the 1850s or thereabouts. And from the moment that Napier landed with his force and moved inland, he was out of any direct telegraphic communication with London. He just proceeded to Addis Ababa, won the war, and came back and told the government which side had won. And that, from a soldier's point of view, is the ideal way to fight a war, that you don't have but it is much more difficult now. And of course, it was true that Churchill made himself a terrible nuisance to all the desert generals especially, constantly sending signals demanding action. And actually one of many things that was great about Alan Brooke, the head of the army, is that Alan Brooke formed a shield trying to protect the commanders in the field from Churchill's relentless activism and interference. And sometimes Churchill's activism was a good thing, because British generals did tend to be pessimists after losing so many battles. But in principle, I don't think I'd recommend it. And that some of you may have heard of a book by Eliot Cohen, which you know well, called The Supreme Command, which had a vogue a few years ago, in which Eliot Cohen argued he chose some case studies, Lincoln, Churchill, Ben-Gurion in Israel, and I've forgotten who the other one was, you might remember. But he chose these case studies to illustrate why political leaders ought to take over the direction of wars when their country is involved. But actually, I thought his comparison was quite wrong, because for every Churchill or Lincoln or Ben-Gurion who's something close to a genius, we often have absolute boobies in charge politically. And by and large, whatever balls-ups the generals make these days, we're probably better off to let the generals do it than to let the politicians try and run it.
Well, I gather that, I mean, from what the newspaper reports say, that President Putin is interfering constantly with what's happening on the front in Ukraine.
One wishes he'd interfere rather more, if that's the...
Can I just go back to Operation Biting? But again, it's a question I think that comes up again and again, is why is cooperation between services on the same side often so difficult? I mean, sometimes you feel they spend as much time fighting each other as they do the enemy.
It's always been, there's always been enormous tensions between armies and navies, and in modern times with air forces as well. And there's always been huge mutual jealousies. And I think one of the things, although there were problems in Britain, Britain was pretty lucky with its top military leadership in the Second World War, whereas the Americans, one of the things, when the British chiefs of staff first met the American chiefs of staff, they were absolutely stunned to discover that the US Army and the US Navy were barely on speaking terms. And that situation continued till the end of the war. And what was amazing about the way the American system worked, Admiral Ernest King, the monster who was Chief of Naval Operations, was all-powerful. And Ernest King was able really to run the US naval war efforts without reference to anybody, without reference to Roosevelt or the Army or anything else. What was amazing about America, America was so rich and so powerful that it could somehow win the war despite that. But it wasn't an ideal arrangement that relations were so poor. And so they were always, the British and American chiefs of staff were always having convivial lunches and dinners and telling each other how much they loved each other. But it was all nonsense, of course. Allenbrook thought that the Americans were quite unfit to run anything, and that he, Allenbrook, ought to be running the entire Allied war effort. The Americans thought that the British were trying to get the Americans constantly to lose American boys' lives to protect the British Empire. And so it went on. And I think all you have to do is accept alliances are very difficult. And another of Churchill's great lines, when he said the only thing that's worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. Something that the Brexiters, I think, might well have heeded some little while ago, but that's another story. But making alliances work is unbelievably difficult. And actually, there's one particular problem in the Second World War, which was the British Army has always liked to make war with a light heart. And that means that they do jokes. And the US Army were appalled by the British officers' habits of making jokes even in the middle of battles. And this convinced them they were not serious people. And they used to get frightfully angry, American generals, about all the silly schoolboy jokes that the British made. But the British said, well, this war's been going on for a lot longer for us chaps, and frankly, it'd be absolutely intolerable if we didn't have a few laughs in the middle of all this.
But the military, and I guess all of us, are always very keen to draw lessons out of events. So were lessons drawn from Operation Biting?
The first lesson, which Johnny Frost, who commanded it, took very much aboard, was special forces should stay small.
No.
And the big mistake the British made was they kept expanding their special forces in the war. And I've argued in several of my books that when the invasion of Northwest Europe happened in 1944, they should have wound up the commandos, the SAS, the long-range desert group, all these people who've been great in the raiding era of the war. But now that the war had become collisions between massive armies, that all these little units, private armies, were an embarrassment.
Yeah.
But of course, politically, propaganda had made them such a big issue. And also the other thing was, it's quite extraordinary. The Second World War was the last war in which British aristocrats were able to do pretty much what they wanted and choose their jobs. Yeah. And some of them were very brave. But the people who were, a lot of the people, quite a few of the ones who were running the SAS and a lot of those who were running the commandos were members of whites, and they'd sort of fixed all this up at the beginning of, and nobody really, you could go up against your fellow chiefs of staff, you could argue with Allenbrook and so on, but it was almost impossible to argue with the membership of whites. And so all these forces went on till the end of the war. And actually the commandos and the SAS, there were some absolute disasters in France with the SAS in 1944. And I've argued very strongly that, I say, they were very useful during the early desert stays, but then they should have been wound up.
Yeah.
But we do have this weakness for special forces. We love people who wear green berets or maroon berets, or, we love special forces.
Well, I think in the same way we love movies in which, single-handed Sylvester Stallone defeats a whole lot of bad guys. I mean, I think it's a natural sort of thing. You want to see good triumph over evil, especially for lots of evil people. Can we just go back to the problems with seaborne invasions? Because Operation Biting succeeded, and as you say, and having read your book, it sometimes seems to me miraculous it did. I mean, they were waiting on the beach for the Navy to come, which it almost didn't. Dieppe did not succeed. The Normandy landings, which is about to be commemorated again, did succeed, but I think it was touch and go at the beginning. And I'm thinking of the present, because one of the flashpoints is between China and Taiwan, of course. And looking back at the Second World War and the Seaborne landings, or the Korean War and Incheon, I mean, do nations still have the capacity to do it? Does China have the capacity to do it with Taiwan?
Well, the good news is that it's the Chinese who've got the problem of taking the huge risk of landing on a hostile shore. And although the military situation, I read a lot of American stuff, and a lot of serious American analysts are still very unsure whether the Chinese can pull off an invasion of Taiwan, because it's very difficult landing on a hostile shore. But it's very hard to say because the technology is changing so quickly. Operation Biting, as you rightly say, it nearly came to grief at the last hurdle, that after Johnny Frost and his company had landed, they'd overrun the radar station. They managed to take out under fire all the vital components. They got them down to the beach after a fierce fight with the Germans manning the defenses of the beach. They got down to the beach, and Johnny Frost said, well, all we want now is the Navy. And they looked out at the sea on this moonlit night, and it was absolutely empty. There wasn't a sign to be seen. And they flashed their torches, and they sent all the signals, and nothing happened. And in fact, the landing craft, commanded by a not very imaginative officer, I think, they said they couldn't see the torch flashes, and they were lingering a mile offshore, and they said they'd seen all the gun flashes and flares going up, and they found it all very confusing, and they couldn't decide whether they were being asked to come in or not. And so Johnny Frost and his company sat on the beach, getting gloomier and gloomier. Well, they had mad ideas. First of all, there was a fishing boat on the beach. They said, well, perhaps we're going to have to push that into the sea. And then they worked out that could only carry 9 people, and that wasn't going to get them far. And then some of them said, well, who thinks that we're good enough to swim this? And then some of them, brave men, started saying to each other, we're going to be captured, because they could hear the Germans blazing away on top of the cliff. And they sat there for 3/4 of an hour, up to an hour, before at last these landing craft appear. And what one has to remember is that most of the Royal Navy and most of everybody's navies, they'd all been recruited from civilian life a year or two ago. They'd never seen a landing craft until a few months before. They'd been wine merchants, and they'd been architects, and they'd been this, that, and the other. And they didn't know much about navigation, and they didn't know much about how you handle a landing craft on a hostile shore. Well, by the grace of God, because the Germans were having an off night, they were able to get everybody in the boats and sail triumphantly off for their triumphant welcome at Portsmouth, with everybody playing Rule Britannia over the ship's broadcast system. But that only happens once in a lifetime, or once in a war. And in fact, even the naval officer in command of the landing craft, he said, I never could figure out how the Germans failed to take us all out. There's little pause involved in all these. But coming back to the landing craft thing, I mean, D-Day was also a sort of miracle. Yeah. The one advantage the Germans had on D-Day, they were there, they were in France, they were on the battlefield. And yet the British and the Americans and the Canadians had to deploy stupendous resources just to get to the battlefield. And a huge amount of stuff that they created for Operation Neptune, as it was then called, just the business of getting ashore, was stuff that became completely irrelevant once they got there. But they had to spend countless hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds building the Mulberry harbours and building all this specialised kit and amphibious tanks, all just for this business of getting ashore. And it was jolly difficult. And I mean, one thing, I'd just been writing something about D-Day, and I was saying that one thing the generals were not very imaginative about is figuring out that the poor guys who've been in the landing craft for 2 or 3 hours before they hit the beach, they were all almost prostrate with seasickness. And half of them landed literally covered in vomit. And it's not a good start to having to fight a battle on a beach in Normandy, that you've been through that sort of experience. And the generals should have been a bit brighter about figuring out just what 3 hours bucketing about in a landing craft. And I can tell you one thing, when I was writing my first book about Overlord, about the D-Day, the Normandy campaign, and I was sitting at home in Northamptonshire, then writing this book and thinking, what was it like to be crouched in a landing craft? And then purely by chance, 2 months later, I found myself crouched in a landing craft on one's way to the Falklands one night with the naval bombardment crack boom overhead. And one realized it was bloody uncomfortable and bloody cold. And in fact, the only sensible thing I did that day, which soldiers aren't allowed to do, or that night, was all the soldiers had to wade ashore. And so they all got their feet wet, literally, and they were wandering around with cold feet for the next 3 days. And that doesn't sound too serious, but actually it's no fun having to dig trenches and deal with all that. And I'd actually landed in my tennis shoes so that I kept my boots dry, but I could only do that because I wasn't a soldier. But on D-Day and even Operation Viking, nobody was able to land in tennis shoes and carry their boots.